A desperate Bigfoot led me into the forest. What was waiting there changed everything. You can believe this or not. I don't care anymore. I've stayed silent for 5 years, and the silence is heavier than the truth ever was. October 2019. A missing hiker in the Six Rivers National Forest. A search that ended with no answers, and a set of massive barefoot tracks in the mud that everyone told me to forget. I couldn't forget. Those tracks didn't match any animal I'd ever seen in 31 years of backcountry work. So I went back alone, and something was waiting for me. It didn't attack. It didn't run. It stood there in the timber, 80 yards out, watching me. Then it did something I never expected. It looked back over its shoulder and waited for me to follow. What I found at the end of that trail cost me my marriage, my reputation, and nearly my sanity. But the question that haunts me at 3 a.m. isn't what I saw. It's why it chose me. I've never told this story to anyone. Not completely. Not the way it actually happened. But I'm 58 years old now, and I've carried this weight for long enough that it's starting to feel like it might crush me if I don't set it down somewhere. My name is Boyd Harlan. I spent 31 years as a paramedic in rural Humboldt County, California. 31 years of car wrecks on winding mountain roads, logging accidents, heart attacks in cabins 40 minutes from the nearest hospital. I've held people's hands while they died. I've told families things no one should ever have to say. And when my knees finally gave out, too many years of lifting stretchers, climbing embankments, kneeling on asphalt, I transitioned to volunteer search and rescue work. I figured if I couldn't save people from their bodies anymore, I could at least help find them when they got lost. That's what I told myself anyway. The truth is, I couldn't stop. Some people retire and take up fishing or woodworking. I needed to keep being useful. Linda, my wife of 26 years at that point, she understood, or at least she pretended to. She'd learned a long time ago that I wasn't the kind of man who could sit still. The call came on a Tuesday evening in late October of 2019. I remember because Linda and I had just finished dinner, and I was washing dishes when my phone buzzed with the SAR alert. A solo hiker named Dennis Pruitt, 34 years old, had missed his check-in after entering the Six Rivers backcountry via the Onion Lake trailhead. His girlfriend had called it in when he didn't answer his phone for 2 days straight. I dried my hands and started packing before the message even finished loading. Boyd, Linda was standing in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, not angry, just tired. She'd seen this before. Grid search starts at first light, I said. I'll be back tomorrow night, 2 days at most. She nodded. She always nodded. Here's something you learn. After 3 decades of emergency response, the margin between rescue and recovery is often just hours, sometimes less. A person with a broken ankle can survive for days if they have water and shelter. But a person with a head injury, or internal bleeding, or hypothermia, every minute matters. And solo hikers are the worst. No one to splint their leg, no one to keep them warm, no one to go for help. They just lie there, wherever they fell, and wait for someone to find them. I joined the grid team at the staging area near Onion Lake just after sunrise. There were about 15 of us, a mix of SAR volunteers, a few Forest Service rangers, and a K-9 unit from the county sheriff's office. Gary Rourke, our SAR coordinator, ran the briefing. He's a good man, Gary. Former Forest Service himself, 20-plus years coordinating searches. He knows these mountains better than most people know their own backyards. We had Pruitt's last known coordinates from his phone before it died. We had a photo from his girlfriend, a thin guy with a beard and a confident smile, the kind of smile that said he'd done this 100 times before. We had his planned route, his gear list, his experience level. What we didn't have was any idea what had happened to him. I took my grid assignment without complaint, a drainage about 2 miles northeast of the trailhead that nobody else wanted because the terrain was steep and the brush was thick. That was fine by me. I've always preferred working alone, fewer distractions, easier to listen. And in search and rescue, listening is half the job. The first day of a search is always the most hopeful. You're fresh, the dogs are eager, and there's still a reasonable chance you'll find your subject sitting against a tree with a twisted ankle, embarrassed but alive. By the second day, the math starts to change. By the third, you're not searching for a survivor anymore. You're searching for a body. We worked in shifts, covering ground in systematic sweeps. The dogs tracked Pruitt's scent for about 1.5 miles past the trailhead before losing it near a seasonal creek that had been running high from recent rains. The handlers figured he'd crossed the water somewhere and the current had scattered his trail. It happens. Doesn't mean anything good or bad, just means the dogs can't help anymore. I was assigned to the same drainage both days, working my way upstream through stands of Douglas fir so old and thick that the canopy blocked out most of the sky. The terrain was brutal, steep slopes covered in deadfall, creek beds choked with moss-slick boulders. My knees screamed at me every time I had to scramble over a fallen trunk, but I kept going. That's the job. It was late on the second day when I found the tracks. I almost missed them. The light was getting low, and I was focused on a rock outcrop about 50 yards ahead, trying to decide if it was worth checking for shelter spots. But something made me look down, some instinct maybe, or just the way the mud caught the fading sun. There were impressions in the soft ground near the creek bank, a line of them spaced out in a walking pattern, barefoot, 5 toes each, clearly defined, and big, not human big, wrong big. I've seen a lot of tracks in my life. Bear, elk, mountain lion, human in every kind of footwear. These didn't match anything. The stride length was too great for the foot size, like something with legs longer than they should be for its frame. And the depth of the impressions suggested serious weight. 400 pounds, maybe more. I photographed them, measured the stride with my arm span, roughly 4.5 feet between prints. Then I hiked back to the staging area and showed the photos to Gary. He looked at them for about 10 seconds. Bear drag marks, he said. Maybe a mudslide pattern from the rain. Good eye, though. I wanted to argue. The prints weren't drag marks. They were distinct impressions, weight-bearing, clearly bilateral. But Gary had already moved on to the next update, and I knew how it would sound if I pushed. Boyd's seeing things. Boyd's been out in the brush too long. The search was called off on day 3. Dennis Pruitt was officially classified as a missing person. Case open, no leads. His girlfriend held a press conference that nobody watched. His family put up flyers that the rain would dissolve within a week. I drove home that night with the photos still on my phone, unable to stop thinking about those tracks, about what could have made them, about why they were so close to where Pruitt had vanished. Linda asked me how the search went. I told her we didn't find him. I didn't tell her about the tracks. I didn't tell her that something was already pulling me back toward that drainage, toward a question I couldn't answer and couldn't let go. Some doors, once you notice them, are impossible to ignore. A week passed. 7 days of pretending everything was normal while something gnawed at me from the inside. I couldn't sleep. I'd lie in bed next to Linda, staring at the ceiling, running calculations in my head. Stride length, foot size, weight distribution. I'd been a paramedic long enough to understand how bodies move, how weight transfers through limbs, how gait patterns tell stories about the thing that made them. And every time I closed my eyes, I saw those tracks in the mud, and nothing about them made sense. On the 4th night, I got out of bed at 2 a.m. and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop. I pulled up my photos and started measuring again, using the creek stones as reference points, comparing the proportions against every database I could find. Black bear, grizzly, human. Nothing matched. The stride was too long for the foot length, the depth was too consistent for drag marks, and the toe definition was too clear for any kind of mudslide pattern. Gary was wrong. I knew it in my bones, the way I used to know when a patient was lying about their pain level, or when a family was hiding something about how an accident happened. 31 years of reading scenes had given me instincts I couldn't ignore, even when I wanted to. By the 6th day, I'd stopped pretending I wasn't going back. "I'm heading out tomorrow," I told Linda over dinner. "Just a day hike. Clear my head." She set down her fork and looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in days. "Boyd, you've been somewhere else all week. What's going on?" I almost told her. The words were right there, sitting on my tongue like a confession waiting to happen. I found something out there, something I can't explain, and I need to know what it was. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I said, "The Pruitt case is still bothering me. I just want to walk the area one more time, for my own peace of mind." It wasn't a lie exactly. It just wasn't the whole truth. Linda nodded slowly, the way she always did when she knew I was holding something back but had decided not to push. 26 years of marriage teaches you when to fight and when to let go. "Be careful," she said, "and be home before dark." "I will." I packed my bag that night. Trauma kit, force of habit, headlamp, extra batteries, water bladder, emergency bivy, granola bars. More medical supplies than a normal day hiker would carry. But I'd learned a long time ago that being overprepared was better than being dead. I added a fresh notebook and a better camera, the one I used for documenting accident scenes back when I was still on active duty. I told myself I was just going to look, just going to check the drainage one more time, see if the rain had revealed anything new, maybe find some explanation that would let me sleep again. I told myself this was about closure, but somewhere deeper, in a part of my brain, I didn't want to examine too closely. I knew I was looking for something else. Something that had left those tracks. Something that might still be out there, watching the same forest I was about to walk into alone. I left before dawn the next morning, while Linda was still asleep. I didn't wake her to say goodbye. I'm not sure why. Maybe because I was afraid that if I looked her in the eye, she'd see what I was really doing, and she'd try to stop me. The drive to the Onion Lake trailhead took about 90 minutes. The sun was just cresting the ridgeline when I pulled into the empty parking area, and the forest stretched out ahead of me like a question I couldn't stop asking. I shouldered my pack and started walking. The drainage looked different than I remembered. A week of October rain had transformed the landscape. The seasonal creek was running higher now, its voice louder, filling the space between the trees with a constant rushing murmur. The mud where I'd found the tracks had been washed clean. No impressions, no evidence. Nothing but smooth, wet earth and scattered stones. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty ground, feeling something sink in my chest. Part of me had hoped the tracks would still be there, that I could photograph them again or with better equipment. Maybe take a casting, build a case that even Gary couldn't dismiss. But the rain had erased everything. All I had now were the photos on my phone and my own stubborn certainty that I hadn't imagined what I'd seen. I pushed deeper. The terrain climbed steadily as I followed the creek upstream, moving into a section of old-growth forest I hadn't reached during the official search. The Douglas firs here were massive, trunks wider than my arm span, bark furrowed deep enough to hide your hand. The canopy closed overhead like a cathedral ceiling, filtering the sunlight into dim green columns that barely reached the forest floor. It was around mid-afternoon when I first noticed the silence. I've spent a lot of time in the woods, enough to know that forests are never really quiet. There's always something: birdsong, squirrel chatter, the rustle of wind through branches, the distant hammer of a woodpecker, the soundtrack of a living ecosystem, so constant that you stop hearing it after a while. But this was different. This was absence. I stopped walking and stood still, listening. Nothing. No birds, No squirrels, no insects. Even the creek seemed muted somehow, its voice swallowed by the trees. The silence wasn't empty, it was occupied, like the forest was holding its breath. Then the smell hit me. It came on a shift in the breeze, a thick, musky odor that coated the back of my throat and made my eyes water. Rotten, organic, but not like decomposition. More like wet dog mixed with something sour and vegetative. I've encountered bear scat, elk musk, bodies in various stages of decay. This was none of those things. This was something I had no reference for. I turned slowly, scanning the timber in every direction. The trees stood motionless. The ferns didn't stir, but the feeling of being watched crawled over my skin like insects, settling into the base of my skull where instinct lives. Something was out there. Something close enough for me to smell. Something that had silenced every other living thing in the area just by being present. My rational mind started cycling through explanations. A bear, downwind, close enough to spook the wildlife. A dead animal I hadn't found yet, its decay carried on the breeze. My own exhaustion playing tricks on me after a week of sleepless nights. But my body knew better. My body remembered 31 years of walking into scenes where something was wrong before I could see what it was. And every nerve I had was telling me the same thing. You are not alone. I stood there in the silence, breathing through my mouth to avoid the smell, waiting for something to happen. The forest waited with me, and somewhere in the green shadows between the ancient trunks, something watched, was certain of it. I don't know how long I stood there. Minutes, probably, though it felt longer. Time does strange things when your body floods with adrenaline and your senses sharpen to a point that's almost painful. Every shadow became a shape. Every tree trunk held the potential for something hiding behind it. I was about to convince myself I was being paranoid, that the silence was just a coincidence, that the smell was just a dead elk somewhere upwind, when I saw it. Movement. About 80 yards out, partially screened by a cluster of Douglas firs, something that didn't belong to the pattern of the forest. At first, my brain tried to make it into something familiar. A bear, standing on its hind legs to get a better look at me. A hunter in dark clothing, maybe wearing one of those ghillie suits that break up your silhouette. A trick of the fading light filtering through the canopy, creating shapes where there weren't any. But it wasn't any of those things. It was upright, tall, taller than any person I'd ever seen, even accounting for the distance. 7 feet at least, maybe more. Broad across the shoulders in a way that suggested mass, real mass, the kind of weight that could snap branches without trying. Dark, shaggy, covered in something that wasn't fur exactly, but wasn't hair either, something in between, and it was standing perfectly still, watching me. I've seen a lot of things in my life that scared me. Accident scenes that looked like war zones. People with injuries that shouldn't have been survivable. The slow decline of patients I couldn't save no matter how hard I tried. But I'd never felt fear like this. A cold, ancient thing that bypassed my rational mind entirely and spoke directly to something primitive in my brainstem. Run, that part of me said. Run now. But I didn't run. I couldn't. My legs wouldn't move. My eyes wouldn't look away from that shape in the trees. That impossible figure that stood there like it had been waiting for me. Like it had known I would come back. We watched each other. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, loud and fast, drowning out even the muted sound of the creek behind me. Then it did something that changed everything. It turned. Slowly, deliberately, with a fluid grace that didn't match its size. It took a step away from me, moving deeper into the forest. And then it paused, looked back over its shoulder, directly at me. The gesture was unmistakable. I've seen it 1,000 times in my life. From people, from dogs, from children who want you to follow them somewhere. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't fleeing. It was waiting, inviting. Come with me. That's what it meant. I knew it the same way I knew my own name. Something out there in the ancient timber was asking me to follow. Every survival instinct I'd honed over 30 years told me to turn around, walk back to my truck, drive home, forget what I'd seen, tell no one. But those tracks in the mud, that impossible stride length, the silence of the forest, the smell. Dennis Pruitt, still missing, never found. The figure took another step, then paused again. Waiting. I started walking. I should have turned back. Every piece of training I'd ever received, SAR protocols, wilderness survival, basic common sense, said the same thing. Don't follow unknown subjects into unfamiliar terrain. Don't leave your planned route without telling someone. Don't pursue something you can't identify, especially when you're alone and miles from help. But I kept walking. The creature, I didn't know what else to call it, stayed ahead of me, maintaining a consistent distance of about 60 or 70 yards, close enough for me to track its movement through the trees, far enough that I couldn't make out details beyond that initial impression of height and mass and dark, shaggy covering. It moved like nothing I'd ever seen. Silent, despite its size. Fluid, despite the rough terrain. It navigated deadfall and boulder fields without breaking stride, without snapping branches, without disturbing the ferns that grew thick along the forest floor. I'm a decent woodsman, but I sounded like a marching band compared to this thing. Every step I took seemed to echo through the silence, and it never rushed. That was the strangest part. It would walk for a while, then pause, turning just enough to confirm I was still following. Then it would continue. Patient, deliberate, like it had somewhere specific to take me, and all the time in the world to get there. I tried to keep track of landmarks as we moved. A distinctive boulder here, a lightning-scarred tree there. But the forest grew denser as we went, the old-growth canopy blocking more and more of the sky until the light turned green and dim, like being underwater. I lost my bearings somewhere in the first half-mile. By the time we'd covered what I estimated to be a full mile, I had no idea which direction my truck was anymore. My rational mind kept trying to reassert control. What are you doing? This is insane. You're following an unknown animal into wilderness you don't know, with no backup, no communication, no plan. If something happens to you out here, no one will ever find your body. But another part of me, a quieter part, buried deep, was asking different questions. What is this? Where is it taking you? Why does it want you to follow? That backward glance, that patient waiting. There was intention behind it. Intelligence. This wasn't a predator leading prey into an ambush. The body language was wrong for that. This was something else. Something I didn't have a framework for. The smell came and went as we walked, stronger when the breeze shifted in my direction. Musky, organic, overwhelming. I breathed through my mouth and kept moving. We'd been walking for maybe 40 minutes when the terrain began to change. The ground sloped downward, the firs giving way to thicker undergrowth, sword ferns, bracken, tangles of fallen branches covered in moss. Ahead, I could see the land dropping away into some kind of ravine, choked with vegetation so dense it looked almost impenetrable. The creature paused at the edge of the descent, turned to look at me one more time, then it stepped over the edge and disappeared into the green darkness below. I stood there, heart pounding, staring at the place where it had vanished. Somewhere below, hidden by the undergrowth, something was waiting for me. Something I couldn't see. Something I couldn't explain. I could still turn back, find my way out somehow, pretend none of this had happened. Instead, I grabbed a root for balance and started climbing down. The ravine swallowed me whole. Within 20 feet of the edge, the undergrowth closed in so thick I could barely see more than a few yards in any direction. Sword ferns taller than my waist. Bracken that grabbed at my legs with every step. Fallen timber covered in moss so deep and wet it squished under my boots like a sponge. The light filtering through the canopy turned everything a dim, murky green, like the forest had pulled a curtain closed behind me. I grabbed roots and branches to control my descent, half climbing, half sliding down the steep embankment. My knees screamed in protest, the same knees that had ended my paramedic career, that ached every morning and kept me awake on cold nights. But I kept going. I'd come too far to stop now. The creature was gone. I'd lost sight of it the moment it dropped over the edge, and now I couldn't see any sign of its passage. No broken ferns, no disturbed moss, no footprints in the soft earth. It had vanished into the undergrowth like smoke dissolving in air. I paused halfway down, pressing my back against a mossy boulder to catch my breath. The silence was total. Not even the creek I'd been following was audible anymore. Either I'd moved too far from it, or the ravine walls were blocking the sound. All I could hear was my own ragged breathing and the wet drip of moisture from the canopy above. For the first time since I'd started following, doubt crept in. Real doubt. The kind that settles in your stomach like a stone and whispers that you've made a terrible mistake. I was alone. Deep in terrain I'd never mapped, never searched, never even knew existed. No one knew where I was. My phone had lost signal miles back. If I fell, if I got hurt, if something happened to me down here, I would simply disappear. Just like Dennis Pruitt. The thought hit me harder than I expected. Was this what had happened to him? Had he seen something in these woods, followed it into the wild, and never come out? Was I walking the same path right now, toward the same end? I almost turned back. Almost. Then I heard it. A sound from somewhere below. Low, rhythmic, rising and falling in a pattern that wasn't random. Not a growl, not a bird call, something almost vocal, almost deliberate. Like a moan, but deeper. Like grief given a voice. I held my breath, listening. The sound came again, muffled by the undergrowth, but definitely there. Definitely real. My hands were shaking as I pushed off the boulder and continued my descent. The embankment leveled out gradually, the slope easing until I was walking on relatively flat ground, pushing through walls of ferns that soaked my pants to the thigh. The green light grew dimmer. The air grew heavier, thick with moisture and that musky smell that had followed me since the first sighting. I reached the bottom of the ravine and stopped. The creature was gone. I stood in a narrow channel of flat ground, hemmed in on both sides by rock walls covered in dripping moss. The vegetation here was even denser than above, forming a canopy of ferns and branches that turned the space into a kind of tunnel. I couldn't see more than 30 feet in any direction. I was completely alone, completely lost. And somewhere ahead, hidden in the green darkness, something was making a sound I'd never heard before. I checked my headlamp, made sure the batteries were fresh, adjusted the straps on my pack, took a deep breath that tasted like moss and rot and something wild. Then I pushed forward into the bracken, toward the sound, toward whatever was waiting for me at the end of this impossible path. I almost missed it. The shelter was tucked against a rock outcrop, hidden behind a curtain of hanging ferns so thick it looked like just another wall of vegetation. I would have walked right past if I hadn't noticed the structure underneath, the deliberate weave of branches, the strips of bark woven between them, the clear intention behind the construction. Someone had built this, not humans. The proportions were wrong, the materials too raw, the location too remote, but someone, something, had taken branches and bark and ferns and assembled them into a shelter, a dwelling, a place of protection. I pushed through the fern curtain and stopped. Inside, curled on a bed of dried ferns and leaves, was a figure. Smaller than the one I'd followed. Maybe 4 feet tall, with the same dark covering, the same general shape, but softer somehow. Younger. A juvenile. It looked at me with eyes that held more expression than any animal I'd ever seen. Fear. Exhaustion. Pain. And underneath all of that, something I can only describe as hope, like it had been waiting for something, and maybe I was it. Then I saw the leg. The right leg was twisted at an angle below the knee that made my stomach lurch. The break was old, days at least, maybe longer. The flesh around it was swollen, discolored, the skin tight and shiny with infection. I could smell it now, underneath the musk. The sweet, sick smell of tissue beginning to die. 31 years of training kicked in before my conscious mind caught up. I was already kneeling, already reaching for my pack, already cataloging the injury the way I'd cataloged 1,000 injuries before. Compound fracture, likely tibial, significant infection, possibly septic. Without treatment, this creature, this child, because that's what it was, a child, would die. Maybe in days, maybe in hours. I understood then, with a clarity that cut through my fear like a blade. The adult had found me. It had watched me during the search for Dennis Pruitt, seen me moving through the forest with purpose and care, looking for someone who was lost. It had recognized something in my behavior, compassion maybe, or competence, or just desperation similar to its own. And it had chosen me. It had led me here, to this hidden ravine, to this crude shelter, to this injured child. Because it had no other options. Because it couldn't fix this on its own. Because somewhere in its alien mind, it had decided to trust a human being with its most vulnerable secret. The weight of that trust settled over me like a physical thing. From the tree line behind me, I heard movement, a branch creaking under massive weight, a low vocalization, the same moaning sound I'd heard during my descent, but closer now. The adult was there, watching, waiting to see what I would do. I looked at the juvenile, at those eyes full of fear and hope, at the leg that would kill it if no one intervened. I opened my trauma kit. "Okay," I said softly, not knowing if it could understand but needing to say something. "Okay, I'm going to help you. Just hold still." My hands were shaking, but I got to work. 31 years. That's how long I spent responding to emergencies, car accidents on rain-slicked mountain roads, chainsaw injuries at logging sites, heart attacks in remote cabins where the nearest hospital was an hour away by ambulance. I've worked on bodies so broken I didn't know where to start. I've kept people alive through sheer stubbornness when every vital sign said they should already be dead. And in all those years, I never once hesitated. Not when the blood was pumping. Not when the clock was ticking. You can't hesitate in emergency medicine. Hesitation kills people. But kneeling at the entrance to that shelter, looking at that injured juvenile, I hesitated. Just for a moment. Because this wasn't a human being. This wasn't anything I'd been trained for. This was something that shouldn't exist. Something that defied every category my mind tried to put it in. Then the juvenile whimpered, a soft, high sound that cut through my paralysis like a knife. And 31 years of training took over. I opened my trauma kit and laid out my supplies on a flat rock beside the shelter entrance. Saline for irrigation, gauze pads, antibiotic ointment, ace bandages, medical tape, a pair of shears. My hands moved on autopilot, muscle memory taking control, while my conscious mind tried to catch up with what was happening. "Okay," I said softly. "I'm going to help you. I need you to stay still." I don't know if it understood my words, but it understood my tone. That calm, steady voice I'd used on 1,000 terrified patients over the years. The voice that says, "I'm here. I've got you. Everything's going to be okay." The juvenile's breathing slowed slightly. Its eyes stayed locked on my face. I moved closer, keeping my movements slow and deliberate. The smell inside the shelter was overwhelming. That same musky odor I'd been tracking all afternoon, mixed with the sour stench of infection. I breathed through my mouth and focused on the leg. The break was worse than I'd initially thought. The tibia had snapped below the knee, and the bone hadn't set properly, probably because the juvenile had tried to move on it before the fracture stabilized. The skin around the wound was hot to the touch, swollen tight, discolored in shades of red and purple that told me infection had taken hold days ago. Without treatment, this creature would have died. Maybe within a week, maybe less. I started by cleaning the wound. I poured saline over the infected area, washing away dirt and debris as gently as I could. The juvenile flinched, but didn't pull away. Its hands, smaller versions of the massive hands I'd seen on the adult, with thick fingers and dark nails, gripped the fern bedding beneath it, knuckles tight with pain. "I know," I murmured. "I know it hurts. Almost done with this part." From somewhere behind me in the tree line at the edge of the ravine, I heard movement, heavy footfalls, pacing back and forth. And that sound again, that low, rhythmic vocalization that rose and fell like keening, like grief, like a parent watching their child suffer and being unable to do anything about it. I didn't turn around. I couldn't afford to lose focus, but I was acutely aware of the adult's presence, watching me from the shadows, waiting to see what I would do. I applied antibiotic ointment to the wound, then packed it with clean gauze. The juvenile whimpered again, but held still. I found myself talking constantly, not because I thought it understood, but because silence felt wrong. I told it about my daughter, who was 24 now and living in Portland. I told it about Linda and how she always complained about the medical supplies cluttering our garage. I told it about my first day as a paramedic, when I'd thrown up behind the ambulance after my first fatal accident. I don't know why I said any of it. Maybe I needed to hear a human voice, even if it was my own. Maybe I needed to remind myself that I was still Boyd Harlan, still a person, still connected to a world that made sense. The splint was the hardest part. I found 2 straight branches near the shelter entrance, stripped the bark, and positioned them on either side of the broken leg. The juvenile cried out when I tightened the ace bandage around them, a sharp, almost human sound that made my chest ache. "Done," I said finally. "All done. You did good." The light outside the shelter had turned golden, then orange, then dim. I'd been working for nearly 2 hours. I backed out of the shelter slowly, my knees screaming in protest after so long spent crouching on the hard ground. My hands were trembling, not from fear anymore, but from exhaustion, from the sustained focus of the work I'd just done. My shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cool October air. The juvenile watched me go, those dark eyes tracking my every movement. Its breathing had steadied. The pain lines around its eyes had softened slightly. I didn't know if my treatment would be enough. Without proper antibiotics, without x-rays, without any of the tools I would have had in a real medical setting, I was just guessing. But I'd done what I could. I'd given it a chance. I stood at the shelter entrance, gathering my supplies, trying to figure out how I was going to find my way back to my truck in the failing light. That's when the adult emerged from the trees. It was closer than it had ever been, maybe 30 feet away, stepping out of the shadows between 2 massive Douglas firs, like it had materialized from the forest itself. In the dim, golden light, I could see it clearly for the first time. The size hit me first. 7 feet tall at least, maybe more. It was hard to judge without a reference point, but it towered over the surrounding underbrush like a monument. The shoulders were impossibly broad, the arms long and thick with muscle, the hands hanging past its knees. The body was covered in dark hair. Not fur exactly, but not human hair either. Something coarser, denser, matted in places. But it was the face that stopped me. The brow ridge was heavy, prominent, casting the deep-set eyes into shadow. The nose was flat and wide. The jaw was massive. It looked almost human, but wrong. Like looking at something from a different branch of the evolutionary tree, something that had split off from our ancestors a million years ago and gone its own way. And those eyes, dark, intelligent, watching me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. This wasn't an animal. Animals don't look at you like that. This was something that understood, something that knew. The adult moved toward the shelter, and I stepped aside instinctively, pressing myself against the rock outcrop to give it room. It didn't look at me as it passed. Its attention was entirely on the juvenile inside. It bent down, that massive frame folding with surprising grace, and reached into the shelter. What happened next broke something in me. It touched the juvenile's face. Gently. The way a parent touches a sick child. The way Linda used to touch our daughter's forehead when she had a fever. The gesture was so unmistakably tender, so completely human, that I felt my eyes burn with tears I didn't expect. A sound escaped from the adult. A low, rumbling vocalization that wasn't a word but carried meaning anyway. Relief. Gratitude. Love. I don't know how I knew what it meant, but I did. Then it turned to me. We stood there, maybe 15 feet apart, and looked at each other. The moment stretched out, suspended in the fading light, and I felt something pass between us that I've never been able to put into words. Recognition, acknowledgement. A debt that couldn't be repaid and didn't need to be. The adult held my gaze for what felt like forever. Then, slowly, deliberately, it turned and walked back into the forest. Within seconds, it had vanished into the undergrowth, silent as smoke, leaving me alone with the sound of my own ragged breathing and a juvenile creature watching me from the shadows of its shelter. I stood there until I couldn't see anything anymore. Then I switched on my headlamp and started the long climb out of the ravine. The climb out of that ravine was the longest of my life. My headlamp carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness, illuminating ferns and deadfall, and the steep embankment I had to scramble up. My knees had gone beyond pain into something worse, a grinding wrongness with every step that told me I'd pay for this trip for weeks. My hands were scraped raw from grabbing roots and rocks. My shirt was soaked through with sweat that had turned cold against my skin. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to what was happening inside my head. I moved on autopilot, letting muscle memory and basic navigation instincts guide me while my conscious mind spun in circles. I kept seeing the juvenile's eyes, that mixture of fear and hope that had cut through every defense I had. I kept hearing the adult's keening vocalization, rising and falling in the darkness like grief made audible. I kept feeling the weight of that final gaze, the moment when something impossible had looked at me and I had looked back and we had both known. What had I just done? What had I just seen? I couldn't make it fit into any framework I had. 31 years of emergency medicine had taught me to categorize, to diagnose, to put things in boxes where they made sense. But there was no box for this. There was no protocol for treating an injured creature that shouldn't exist. No procedure for being chosen by something that defied everything I thought I knew about the world. I found the creek by sound and followed it downstream, away from the old growth section, back toward terrain I recognized. The forest was silent around me. No night birds, no rustling in the underbrush, nothing but my own labored breathing and the splash of water over stones. I didn't know if that silence meant I was still being watched, or if the creatures had simply moved on, retreating deeper into whatever hidden world they came from. It took me nearly 3 hours to reach my truck. When I finally stumbled out of the tree line and saw the familiar shape of my pickup in the empty parking area, I felt my legs almost give out. I leaned against the hood for a long moment, breathing hard, staring up at the stars through gaps in the canopy. The night was clear and cold. October in the mountains. Normal. Ordinary. Completely at odds with everything I'd just experienced. I climbed into the driver's seat and sat there without starting the engine. 20 minutes, maybe longer. I don't know exactly. Time had stopped meaning much. I should call Linda, I thought. I should tell someone where I've been, what I've seen. That's what a rational person would do. That's what the old Boyd, The Boyd who believed in protocols and procedures and the orderly unfolding of cause and effect would have done so, but I didn't call anyone. I couldn't. How would I even begin? Hey, honey. I followed a 7-foot creature into a hidden ravine and spent 2 hours treating its injured child. She'd think I'd had a stroke. She'd call Gary. They'd send someone to find me and I'd end up in a psych evaluation instead of my own bed. So I just sat there in the dark, replaying it all. The backward glance that had started everything. The shelter woven from branches and bark. The juvenile's whimper when I cleaned the wound. The adult's massive hand, touching its child's face with impossible tenderness. Something had asked me for help. Something had trusted me with its most vulnerable secret. And I had helped. I had done what 31 years of training had prepared me to do. I had treated a patient in need, regardless of what that patient was. I started the engine and drove home in silence. No radio, no phone calls, just the dark highway unwinding ahead of me and the weight of what I knew pressing down on my chest like a physical thing. Linda was asleep when I got home. I showered, scrubbing the dirt and sweat and that lingering musky smell from my skin. Then I lay down beside her and stared at the ceiling until dawn, listening to her breathe, wondering if I would ever be able to tell her the truth. I didn't sleep at all that night. I'm not sure I really slept for weeks afterward. 3 days. That's how long I lasted before I went back. I tried to function normally. I went through the motions, made breakfast, answered emails, attended a SAR training session where Gary talked about winter preparedness, and I sat in the back row hearing nothing. I smiled when Linda asked if I was feeling better. I told her the hike had helped clear my head, but every moment I wasn't actively doing something else, my mind was in that ravine. I kept thinking about the juvenile's leg, about whether my field treatment had been enough. I'd stabilized the fracture, cleaned the infection, done everything I could with the supplies I had. But without proper antibiotics, without imaging to check the bone alignment, without follow-up care, I had no idea if it would be enough. The not knowing was unbearable. On the 3rd morning, I told Linda I was going fishing. She looked at me with that patient, worried expression I'd been seeing more and more since the Pruitt search ended. But she didn't argue. 26 years of marriage had taught her when to push and when to let go. I packed fresh supplies, more saline, more gauze, a full course of broad-spectrum antibiotics I'd kept from my paramedic days, technically expired but probably still effective. I told myself I was just going to check on them, make sure the juvenile was recovering, maybe leave the supplies nearby where the adult could find them. I told myself I wasn't desperate to see them again. I told myself this was medical follow-up, nothing more. I was lying, of course. I needed to know it had been real. The drive to the Onion Lake trailhead felt longer than before. The hike to the drainage felt longer still. My knees screamed with every step, reminding me that I wasn't a young man anymore, that I had no business scrambling through remote wilderness alone. But I kept going. I found the ravine without too much difficulty. I'd been paying more attention to landmarks than I'd realized during my frantic hike out. The descent was just as brutal as I remembered, the embankment steep and slick with moisture, the undergrowth closing in like a living wall. When I reached the bottom, I knew immediately that something was wrong. The shelter was gone. Not destroyed. Gone. The rock outcrop where it had been was still there, but the structure itself had vanished. The branches that had formed its walls were scattered through the surrounding brush, looking for all the world like natural deadfall. The fern bed where the juvenile had lain was nowhere to be seen. Even the flat rock where I'd laid out my medical supplies had been moved, half buried under a layer of forest debris. I searched for an hour, growing more frantic with each passing minute. I checked every corner of the ravine, pushed through every wall of bracken, looked for any sign that they had been there. Footprints, broken branches, anything, nothing. They had erased every trace of their presence, every sign that the shelter had existed, that I had been there, that any of it had happened. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed the evidence, leaving nothing but my own memory and the ache in my knees. I stood in the center of the empty ravine, breathing hard, feeling something crack inside my chest. Had I imagined it? Had the stress of the Pruitt search, the sleepless nights, the obsession with those tracks finally broken something in my mind? Was I losing my grip on reality? I was about to leave, about to climb back out of that ravine and drive home and never speak of any of this again, when I noticed the stone. It was sitting on a flat rock near where the shelter entrance had been. At first, I almost didn't see it. My eyes were so focused on searching for larger signs, footprints, broken branches, any trace of the structure I'd knelt inside just 3 days ago, that I nearly walked right past. But something made me stop. Some instinct, maybe, or just the way the pale gray surface caught what a little light filtered down through the canopy. A stone, river smoothed, almost perfectly oval, about the size of my palm. It sat alone on the flat rock, positioned with a precision that couldn't be accidental. There was no debris around it, no leaves, no scattered dirt. Just the stone, placed there like an offering on an altar. I stood over it for a long moment, not touching it. My heart was beating hard again, though I couldn't have said whether it was from hope or fear or something in between. This wasn't natural. Stones don't arrange themselves. They don't find their way onto flat rocks in hidden ravines, positioned just so, waiting to be discovered. Someone had put this here. Something had put this here. For me. I knelt down slowly, my knees protesting the movement, and picked up the stone. It was heavier than it looked, cool and smooth against my scraped palm. I turned it over, examining it from every angle. There were no markings, no scratches, nothing to distinguish it from 1,000 other river stones you might find along any creek in the Six Rivers backcountry. But it wasn't from this ravine. I was certain of that. The creek at the bottom of the drainage was seasonal, barely a trickle this time of year, and the rocks there were rough and angular, not water-worn. This stone had come from somewhere else. Someone had carried it here, to this exact spot, and left it for me to find. A thank you. That's what I thought first. A gesture of gratitude from something that couldn't speak but wanted to communicate anyway. You helped my child. This is what I can give you in return. Or maybe a goodbye. We're gone now. Don't look for us. This is all you'll ever have. Or maybe, and this was the thought that made my chest tighten, maybe it was something else entirely. A token. A marker. Proof that what had happened in this ravine was real. That I hadn't imagined any of it. That somewhere out there in the vast and ancient wilderness, something impossible existed and had trusted me with its most precious secret. I stood there holding the stone for a long time. The forest was silent around me, not the occupied silence I'd felt before, but a true emptiness. Whatever had lived in this ravine was gone, moved on to some other hidden place where humans couldn't find them. They had erased their presence so completely that no one would ever believe this place had been anything other than ordinary wilderness. No one except me. I thought about leaving the stone where I'd found it, putting it back on the flat rock and walking away, leaving this whole experience behind like a fever dream that would fade with time. I could go home to Linda, tell her the fishing trip had helped, try to rebuild the normal life I'd been living before a Tuesday evening call-out had sent me searching for a missing hiker named Dennis Pruitt. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't leave behind the only proof I had. I slipped the stone into my pocket. It settled against my thigh, a small weight that would stay with me for years to come. Then I turned and began the long climb out of the ravine. The hike back to my truck felt different this time. The forest was just forest, trees and ferns, and the distant sound of water, nothing more. No silence, no smell, no feeling of being watched. Whatever window had opened between my world and theirs had closed again, and I was alone in a way I hadn't been since that first afternoon when I'd followed a backward glance into the unknown. I reached the Onion Lake trailhead as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that felt almost offensive in their beauty. I sat in my truck and held the stone in my hand, feeling its weight, its smoothness, its impossible significance. I've never shown it to anyone. Not Linda, not Gary, not the handful of people I've hinted at this story to over the years. It sits in a drawer in my bedroom, wrapped in a piece of cloth, waiting. I don't know what it's waiting for. Maybe nothing. Maybe the day I finally decide to tell the full truth. Maybe this day. I tried to go back to normal. I really did. The first few days after finding the stone, I told myself that was the end of it. The creatures were gone. The ravine was empty, and whatever strange chapter had opened in my life was now closed. I could put the stone in a drawer, file the experience away in some corner of my memory, and move on. That's what a rational person would do. That's what the old Boyd, the Boyd who trusted protocols and procedures and the orderly unfolding of cause and effect, would have done. But I wasn't that Boyd anymore. Something had changed in me down in that ravine, kneeling at the entrance to a shelter that shouldn't exist, treating an injury on a creature that science said was impossible. I couldn't unsee what I'd seen. I couldn't unfeel what I'd felt when that massive figure had looked into my eyes, and I had looked back, and we had both understood. The world was different now. Or maybe I was different. Either way, nothing fit the way it used to. I went back to say our meetings, but I couldn't focus. Gary would be talking about winter protocols or equipment maintenance, and I'd find myself staring out the window, thinking about the way the adult had moved through the forest, silent, fluid, utterly at home in terrain that left me stumbling and gasping. I'd think about the shelter, woven from branches and bark, with a skill that suggested generations of knowledge passed down through some means I couldn't comprehend. I'd think about Dennis Pruitt, still missing, and wonder if he'd seen them too. Wonder if that's why he'd never come home. One evening, about 2 weeks after my last trip to the ravine, I made a decision I still don't fully understand. I went to Gary's office and asked to see the file on the Pruitt search. He looked at me for a long moment, his face unreadable. Why? Just want to review the grid, patterns, I said. See if there's anything we might have missed. Gary leaned back in his chair. He's a good man, Gary. I've said that before. 20 years coordinating searches, countless lives saved or at least given closure. He's seen volunteers burn out, seen them get obsessed with cases they couldn't solve, seen them chase ghosts until they weren't useful anymore. Boyd, he said carefully, the Pruitt case is cold, has been for weeks. You need to let it go. I know, those tracks you found. He cut me off, his voice firm but not unkind. I know you think you saw something, but I've been doing this a long time, and I've seen a lot of people convince themselves of things that weren't there. It happens. The stress of a search, the exhaustion, the wanting to find answers, it plays tricks on you. Gary, stop chasing shadows, Boyd. He held my gaze, and I saw something in his eyes that might have been concern, or might have been warning. For your own sake, let it go. I didn't argue. What was I going to say? I followed a 7-foot creature into a hidden ravine and treated its injured child while it watched from the tree line? He'd have me in a psych evaluation before I finished the sentence. So I nodded and left his office and drove home to Linda, who was waiting for me with that worried expression I'd been seeing too often lately. She asked how my day was. I told her it was fine. We ate dinner in a silence that felt heavier than it used to. That night, while she slept, I sat at the kitchen table and wrote everything down. Every detail I could remember, from the first tracks I'd found near the seasonal creek to the stone I'd pocketed in the empty ravine. I filled 20 pages in a notebook I kept hidden in my desk drawer, writing until my hand cramped and the first gray light of dawn started creeping through the windows. I didn't know it then, But Linda would find that notebook 3 weeks later. And when she did, everything would fall apart. It's been 5 years now. 5 years since that Tuesday evening call-out for a missing hiker named Dennis Pruitt. 5 years since I found those tracks in the mud and everyone told me I was seeing things. 5 years since I followed a backward glance into a hidden ravine and knelt at the entrance of a shelter that shouldn't have existed, treating an injury on a creature that science says is impossible. 5 years, and I still haven't slept through the night. Not once. I live alone now. A small cabin outside of Willow Creek, about 40 minutes from where Linda and I used to have our place. She got the house in the divorce. Not that there was much to fight over. 26 years of marriage, and in the end, it came down to a few pieces of furniture and a question neither of us could answer. What happened to you out there? I don't blame her for leaving. I've said that before, but I want to say it again, because it's important. Linda wasn't cruel. She wasn't heartless. She was a practical woman who had spent nearly 3 decades married to a man who dealt with death and trauma as a daily occupation, and she had weathered all of it. The late-night calls, the stories I couldn't tell her, the silences that stretched between us after particularly bad shifts. She had earned her peace. But what I brought home from that ravine wasn't something she could weather. It wasn't trauma in any sense she recognized. It was something else. A fundamental shift in how I understood the world. A crack in the foundation of everything I thought I knew. And when she found my journal and read what I'd written, I watched her face change in a way I'll never forget. First concern, then fear, then something worse than either, pity. She thought I'd had a breakdown. She thought the stress of the Pruitt search, combined with the transition into retirement and whatever other pressures had been building in my head, had finally snapped something loose. She wanted me to see a doctor. She wanted me to talk to someone. She wanted, more than anything, for there to be an explanation that fit inside the world she understood. I couldn't give her that, so she left. Sometimes I wonder if it would have been different if I'd lied. If I'd told her the journal was fiction, a story I was working on, some late-life creative outlet I'd been too embarrassed to mention. Maybe she would have believed me. Maybe we'd still be together, eating dinner in comfortable silence, growing old the way we'd always planned. But I couldn't lie. Not about this. What happened in that ravine was the most real thing I've ever experienced, and denying it, even to save my marriage, felt like a betrayal I couldn't commit. Not to myself and not to them. I still have the stone. It sits on my nightstand now, that pale gray oval, smooth as glass. I hold it sometimes when I can't sleep, feeling its weight in my palm, remembering the moment I picked it up from that flat rock in the empty ravine. I don't know what it means. I've turned it over in my mind 1,000 times, trying to decode the intention behind it. A thank you, a goodbye, a token of something I don't have words for, or maybe just a stone. Maybe I'm the one who gave it meaning because I needed there to be meaning, because the alternative, that everything I experienced was a delusion, a breakdown, a crack in my own mind, is something I can't accept. I never went back to that ravine. I thought about it. For months after Linda left, I thought about hiking back in there, searching for any trace of them, any sign that they were still out there somewhere in the vast wilderness of the 6 Rivers backcountry. But something stopped me every time. They erased themselves for a reason. They covered their tracks, dismantled their shelter, vanished into the forest with a thoroughness that spoke of long practice. They didn't want to be found. And after what they gave me, that moment of trust, that impossible request for help, the least I could do was respect their wish to remain hidden. I think about Dennis Pruitt sometimes. His case is still open, technically, still unsolved. His family held a memorial service about 6 months after the search was called off, even without a body to bury. I didn't attend. I couldn't face them, knowing what I knew, or thought I knew about what might have happened to him out there. Did he see them too? Did he stumble onto something he shouldn't have? Or wander into territory that belonged to something older and wilder than anything he was prepared for? I don't know. I'll probably never know. His fate is one of the questions that will follow me to my grave, unanswered and unanswerable. But here's the thing that keeps me awake. The thing that sits in my chest like a stone of its own, heavy and immovable. The question isn't what was it. I know what it was. I saw it with my own eyes. The massive frame, the dark covering, the hands that hung past its knees and touched a child's face with impossible tenderness. I felt its gaze on me in that moment of recognition, and I understood, in a way that went deeper than language, that I was looking at something intelligent, something that thought, something that felt, something that grieved. No, the question that haunts me is different. The question is this: what does it mean that it knew to ask? Think about that for a moment. Really think about it. Something watched me during the search for Dennis Pruitt. It observed my behavior, the way I moved through the forest, the care I took, the persistence with which I searched for someone who was lost. And from those observations, it made a decision. It recognized something in me. It judged me capable of helping. And when it had no other options, when its child was dying and its own knowledge wasn't enough, it reached across the vast gulf between our species and asked a human being for mercy. That implies a level of intelligence that terrifies me. Not because I'm afraid of them. I'm not anymore. But because of what it suggests about the world we think we know. How long have they been watching us? How much do they understand about who we are, what we do, how we live? We build our cities and cut our roads and tell ourselves we've mapped every corner of this planet. But out there in the old-growth forests, in the ravines and ridges and places we've never bothered to explore, something has been observing us for longer than we can imagine. And we never even noticed. I'm telling this story now because I'm 63 years old, and my knees are worse than ever, and I don't know how many years I have left. I'm telling it because the weight of carrying it alone has become too heavy, and I need to set it down somewhere before it crushes me entirely. And I'm telling it because someone needs to hear it. Someone needs to know. The forest holds more than we've mapped, more than we've named, more than we've ever dreamed of in our confident, comfortable certainty that we understand the world. Something lives out there in the deep places, something that builds shelters and tends to its injured and erases every trace of its existence when humans come too close. Something that, when it had no other choice, trusted one of us with its most vulnerable secret. And whether you believe me or not, I want you to remember this. The next time you hike into wilderness that feels truly wild, truly ancient, truly untouched, pay attention to the silence. Notice when the birds stop singing. Be aware of what you smell on the wind, because they're watching. They've always been watching. And some doors, once you notice them, can never be closed again.